Welcome back to Identity Crisis. Today we are here to bring you a very, very powerful message, a historical perspective of a social movement that impacted the trajectory of Mexico from the beginning of the 20th century on. So please stay tuned. I hope you enjoy. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome back to Identity Crisis. Cue the music. Think about war. Think about what it takes to go to war. Now think about women. Think about a woman's place in war. Does it have a place? Do you think it has a place? Do you have an idea of what war is supposed to look like and the role that women play in wars? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But in Mexico, the history of war gets a little convoluted when it comes to gender roles, and this is why. If you have Mexican heritage, I am here to tell you that you come from a long lineage of historical perspective where women were willing to head off into war to fight for their social rights, their political rights, their economic rights. Let me paint it for you. It's the early 20th century. 1910, 1915, 1920. The Mexican Revolution is underway. Mexico is primarily ruled by very, very wealthy landowners that pretty much control the political class, the politics of the time, the economy. Kind of an age-old story, right? The working class of Mexico was a little fed up. So much so that they were willing to go to war.
Las adelitas, soldaderas were actually a group of women that were pivotal to the war, La Revolución, being won over in Mexico. Oftentimes, they are recognized for all of their efforts. We have to understand and really bring out the complexity that came with the word or the, figures of Las Adelitas. A lot of the times they look like the women that you see behind us, and they hold very true and powerful stories. A lot of the times these women were either taken from their lands and, brought out with the men or the soldiers of both sides of La Revolución, and they were sometimes there unwillingly, and other times, and this is the specific part that we will be talking about today, they actually played a really big role in winning the war. The reason we say that is because these women went on to become generals and colonels and all of these different parts and pivotal, really, really important parts in the war. They led countless men to victory with them. And these women were known to be absolutely ruthless. The same way, and more often than not, the same way that you would describe a man during war, these women were cunning and they were determined to help out the cause. And overall, they are now remembered for being some of the most, and I would argue, the most memorable women in Mexican history. In our family, we have a lot of talking about that. We know about a lot of different stories because if you are a Mexican right now, I would argue that you more than likely have maybe ties to these people, maybe 3-4 generations ago. This was not that long ago. Our great-great-grandmother actually had stories that she would tell us, and my mom would tell us about all of these stories about La Revolución, and it was crazy times, but these women persevered and they did not let out, and they just constantly kept going. There's so many different things that we know about them, not a lot, but what we do know is very interesting.
So hindsight being 2020, and then the historical perspective that we have with the rose-colored glasses and the romance that comes with the fight for revolution. Las adelitas soldaderas end up being a symbol for bravery, for patriotism, and for courage for all Mexican people.
Born in Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua, Adela Velarde was the reason that we actually have named these brave women as las adelitas. She was actually born into a relatively wealthy family. If I'm not mistaken, her grandfather was actually friends with Benito Juarez. So if that kind of goes to tell you where her life was and how pivotal her actual upbringing was, she was around these revolutionaries a lot. Okay, so these thoughts and these ideas of being strong and really strong-willed came from a long lineage of strong-willed men as well. Against the will of her parents, at the age of 13, she joined the ranks of the revolution, La Revolución, as a nurse. So that's where it all started. She became a nurse, and then eventually she fell in love.
After joining the ranks of the military as a nurse at first, and it is rumored, the lore goes that in his deathbed, he said a couple words to her that kind of live on through the Mexican lore. And from that spirit, there's corridos, right? Again, we have to always remember that a lot of the teachings and passings, which we've talked about before, come from the social aspect of what it means to be in a society. That means the dance, the music, the words, the poetry, all of that augments the experience of your culture and the history of that society. So you have corridos, a corrido specifically written to commemorate and romanticize and adore the valor and the bravery of Adela Velarde.
We do want to mention how a lot of the times when we think about Las Adelitas, we have this somewhat romanticized version of what they were. A lot of the times we don't actually think about how profound a lot of the struggles that they went through actually were to them in that moment. There is talks and there is known information in history about the fact that a lot of these women were primarily mestizas and they came from a lot of indigenous backgrounds. If you know anything about La Revolución, you know that it was a lot of working class people against the higher elite. And in that moment, like it has always been in Mexico, unfortunately, the color of your skin was very important and determining where you landed in that hierarchy. So a lot of these women knew that they were on the side that might not win, just because it didn't feel like they could, right? But they abandoned classrooms, they abandoned families. A lot of them actually did go through with it because they wanted to fight for their rights. They didn't have their partners there anymore. So a lot of these women knew that there was really no going back to that. They had partners and families maybe that were with them and they were growing with them and they were, expecting these beautiful lives when the revolution came out. And when all of this happened and their partners went off to war and they didn't know if they were ever going to hear from them again, they just began to get fed up with it and ultimately decided that if there was going to be a way out of this, it was going to be with their hand involved. So it's incredibly inspiring. And now looking at it in almost 100 years after, or actually over 100 years after, we begin to really internalize the struggle that these women went through, and understand the sacrifices that they had to go through in order to create the life that we have now, and to understand that all the complex thoughts and the complex emotions that they went through to get there, it has allowed us Mexicans to live and to be free the way that they are and the way that they wanted us to be overall.
I want to go back to a thing that it might have just breezed by in you watching this video. She left and joined the ranks at the military at 13 years old. When you think about what a 13-year-old girl or guy is doing currently, 2024, you would not in any way, shape, or form recommend that child to go to war on behalf of the things that they believed in or on behalf of the things that their family believed in. But even 100 years ago, which is barely one lifetime ago, really, it's not that long ago when you really put pen to paper and really think about it. So 13 years old, think about that. Think about what that means symbolically, just to further prove why the adelitas soldaderas are a symbol of bravery, a symbol of courage, a symbol of looking to the future, and a symbol that is emblematic of the Mexican spirit. In a lot of ways, it is not unlike the American spirit. It is not unlike the American patriot. It is not unlike the ideology and the romance that comes from being an American, right? If you have Mexican heritage, that you also come from that rich history of patriotism, of fighting for what they believe in.
The reason we actually bring all of this up today and why we're signifying the importance of las adelitas, las soldaderas, is because March, as you guys may or may not know it, is actually Women's History Month. So the reason why we are talking about how wonderful these women were and how crazy it was that even in the early 1900s, at the turn of the century, these women were quite literally standing up against these gender and societal norms. They were actually going against even more like traditions than even we grew up with. They were pioneers. They were just as important. I know a lot of us Mexican Americans here grew up learning about the suffrage movement and grew up seeing Rosie the Riveter, and we grew up seeing Rosa Parks, these wonderful, I'm not discrediting these women, these wonderful women who had a lot to say about the world and the world that they lived in, the society that they had to live in. But as Mexican Americans, I think a lot of the time, all of that information, all of that history is just lost to time, because unless our family goes out of the way to talk to us about that, which we were very fortunate enough to hear it a lot. I think our father was a very big, very, very, very big advocate for women having all of these rights, because anytime he talks about these women, he says, no, these eran chingonas. They say he always talks about how great these women were and how without them, the Mexican Revolution would have never actually happened, and how pivotal and important and substantial, like the weight of their significance was in our history. And he constantly talks about that. And when we start to think about it as Mexican Americans, we begin to see that all of us, even us being first gen here in America, anybody before us, we are all descendants of these wonderful women, because this was happening all over Mexico. There was women from everywhere, all over Mexico, going in and fighting. They were going against all of the norms. They were willing to go through abuse and violence and whatever else might come with being around men, both from their side and the other side. They faced a lot of struggles and a lot of unspeakable things would happen to these women. And not once did they give up, especially whenever you think about that spirit that we talk about. It's an unbreakable spirit. And a lot of the times we don't think about how matriarchal Mexico is, but it really is. And when you hear the women in your family talk, when you hear your abuelitas talk, you could hear that fire burning in them that their mothers gave them. And quite literally, your abuelitas' mothers were adelitas. They were part of it. They grew up with it. They either played a role by being in the war itself, or they played outside roles, and they still garnered and gained a lot of this knowledge that these women allowed them to get. Now, of course, as we all still know, a lot of the stuff that happened to them, it didn't necessarily change the way they were treated in that moment, but they are, like you said, symbols of bravery. And a lot of the time, these women are still revered in Mexico as symbols of bravery and courage and willingness to not give up in whatever fight you're willing to fight, because they stood their ground regardless of what they thought or what they knew was going to be happening to them. At 13 years old, many of them were that age, maybe a little bit older, and they were still willing to go and fight for the cause because they believed in it. And, as we've seen, these women were effective. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, they're considered Mexico's greatest secret when it comes down to that, because if I'm not mistaken, a lot of the people in the opposition didn't know that these women were also soldiers. I think just assumed that these women were not there to fight. And so, they would use that to their advantage. They knew how, different ways to get around and do things that they needed to do in order to become effective members of the military, which I think overall is incredibly impressive. And again, which is why we are shining light on them this entire month. We will be talking about different things that these women or other women in Mexico have done. And we will, put out a little bit more information and a lot of different other things on International Women's Day as well, which is something that will be coming up in the month of March.
So, as we bring Identity Crisis to you, we've made it very clear that Identity Crisis is a segment that is very different from our regular podcast, where we bring you some information that you may or may not have heard of. We bring you some in-depth information. Or if you're a Mexican American that has grown up in the United States and only have gotten American history, we're here to bring you a small piece of Mexican history that you can take back, maybe do your own research and feel very proud of. If you're a Mexican American and the stories of Rosa Parks really mean something to you, if you're a Mexican American and the stories of Emmett Till's mother really mean something to you, if you're Mexican American and you feel that tingling sensation when you hear Selena as also a Mexican American, then you should also think about the name Adela Velarde and feel connected to that history.